is never the answer, yet it occurred constantly throughout history up until the 50s and 60s when the Civil Rights Movement. Prior to this movement, civil liberties were not heavily enforced in regard to the minority groups in America. Hello and welcome to American History Crash Course. Today we will be discussing one of the most impactful turning points of history, the Civil Rights Movement. Moving on to the Civil Rights Movement, it was a major turning point in American history because it emphasized and aided in personal liberties for Americans to increase, and it had lasting political and social consequences.
You just can't cut me off. Hi, I'm Roxana, your second and most entertaining host.
Guys, I'm also certified to host, you know. Hi, I'm Nikita, and today you'll be learning about the Civil Rights Movement. Not like we had to write an essay.
Nikita.
Fight for civil rights has always been evident throughout history, but the 1950s is where it really took off. Post-World War II, Americans prospered economically, and this allowed for the union of minority groups to grow. The rise of suburbs allowed for more families to own automobiles, increasing the standard of living, and continuing the discrimination farther than just the city. However, more activists gained popularity leading into the 1960s, where the movement really flourished.
It's like a volcano, you know? Like, everything that happened before the 50s led up to it, and then the volcano erupted, and then the ashes of freedom were on this nation.
Thank
you know?
Thank you. Yeah.
Wow. Genius.
Okay. Apart from that, this time period saw the reform of many oppressed white Americans, specifically women. The American mother had now gained voting rights in the 1920s and even taken more production and stabilization of the nation to end the crisis. However, they were still looked down upon and treated unfairly in the workforce. Despite the popularity of Rosie the Riveter, many women left the workforce post-World War II. However, leaders such as Betty Friedan aroused the forgotten cause of gender equality throughout her novel, The Feminine Mystique. The 60s saw non-violent approaches from women with sit-ins, protests, and marches to the Supreme Court. Politically, women gained the right of privacy through court cases such as Roe v. Wade, which was the legalization of abortion in the first trimester, and Griswold v. Connecticut, which banned laws forbidding birth control. These liberal movements had grown under the supervision of Justice Earl Warren, who was deemed as a strong liberal and an advocate of civil rights. However, even the most extreme liberal programs, such as the ERA, which was the Equal Rights Amendments, were not passed during this time. The reason the civil rights movement in regard to women was a turning point was that it raised women's status in society and as well as in the workforce. And if this movement had not occurred, prominent figures in our society today, such as Sandra Day O'Connor and Sonia Sotomayor, would not exist.
So what you're saying is that if the Civil Rights Movement never happened, then we wouldn't be hosts today.
Yeah, a lot of jobs would not be available to women, and still today the Civil Rights Movement continues as feminists fight for equal pay. However, the 60s laid the foundation for these movements today.
Oh, this whole time, I thought the Civil Rights Movement was for like those discriminated, like racially.
Well, a majority of it was racial discrimination toward African Americans. However, other minority groups tend to be overlooked.
Native Americans and Chicanos had long been oppressed.
The Dawes Severalty Act refrained Native Americans' civil liberties. This plan set up reservations for the Indians to live on and guaranteed that if they lived the lives set out for them in a civilized manner, then in 25 years they would get full citizenship. However, during FDR's presidency, the Indian Reorganization Act was passed, which encouraged Indians to preserve their culture in an effort to reverse the Dawes Severalty Act. Although the U.S. tried to fix the Indians' problems, not all of their grievances were answered. During the 60s, starting with the Second Battle of Wounded Knee, Indian Americans began expressing their views very violently. Native Americans used tactics such as blocking roads to and from reservations and taking their reservation leader hostage. The most important of these was the takeover of Alcatraz. This was used to represent how Americans took over their land. Politically, Indians gained the Executive Order 11-399 during LBJ's presidency. This order established the National Council on Indian Civil Rights in 1968. Despite all the freedoms they had on the reservations before the 60s, American Indians were oppressed until this order released the tension. Along with Native Americans, Chicanos were long oppressed. During World War II, the Bracero program brought over thousands of Mexican workers that filled the unskilled jobs during the time. However, during World War II, These same Mexican Americans that helped during the war were now looked down upon and treated unfairly. In the 60s, the Chicanos strived for education reforms and were successful in achieving them. Similar to the fight that women and African Americans fought, Chicanos used tactics such as sit-ins at schools led by John Ortiz, boycotts led by Cesar Chavez, and Coretta Scott King, and hunger strikes. The most impactful of these tactics was the longest hunger strike of 25 days led by Cesar Chavez, which captured the public's attention and led to Bobby Kennedy ending the strike by supporting Chicanos' goals for reform. Along with the success from this hunger strike, Chicanos accomplished their goal for educational reform. In the case of Mendez versus Westminster, which ended segregation in schools for Mexican children. This case also had a profound effect on the Brown versus Board of Education court case. This was a turning point because not only did it affect Mexican Americans, but it had an impact on other minority groups.
Finally, it's time to talk about the most infamous movements in history, the African American Civil Rights Movement. Starting with early activists such as Booker T. Washington and W.E.B. Du Bois, African Americans gained most popularity during this time. With the rise of Martin Luther King Jr. as a prominent figure, the African American Civil Rights Movement gained momentum. Granted, their goals were slightly different than the previous Civil Rights Movement, their tactics used were very similar. With Martin Luther King's March on Washington and his I Have a Dream speech, the public sympathized with this movement and thousands of white Americans joined, as seen through the Freedom Riders. Another famous march was the Selma to Montgomery March, otherwise known as Bloody Sunday, which was televised and gained national sympathy and later led to the Voting Rights Act. Organizations such as the NAACP and CORE helped gain support for this movement as well. A well-known act of civil disobedience which was present throughout this time was strongly evident through Rosa Parks, who refused to give up her seat for a white male. This sparked boycotts of buses and other material goods. After the death of Martin Luther King Jr., other leading figures such as Malcolm X took power. This marked a change from a nonviolent to a more violent approach. With the idea of Black Power, Malcolm X, paired with the Black Panthers, began to use violent tactics in order to bring about quick and immediate change. However, the civil rights movement for African Americans were more successful during Martin Luther King's time because of his nonviolent approaches. His nonviolent tactics led to an increased awareness about the movement, which led to Congress passing the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act, which was a provision for eliminating poll taxes and literacy tests. Another success of this situation was in Little Rock 9, Arkansas. This was where Lyndon B. Johnson, the president, had to use military assistance to help escort black students into a white school. Once again, under the supervision of Earl Warren, one of the most influential court cases, Brown versus Board of Education, eliminated segregation in schools. This, paired with the Civil Rights Act, which made segregation illegal in public places, was what labeled this time period as a turning point in American history. Due to the political success during this time, minority groups gained more freedom, which resulted in social change, seen even today as our nation is being led by the first African American president, Barack Obama. This, however, is not covered on the AP test, but is critical to understand the impact that this movement has had on modern society.
Wow, Nikita, despite your aloof comments, there's actually something up there.
After America started their own revolutions in the pursuit for democracy, other nations followed their model. Now, due to this movement, not only did it change the social circumstances in America, but also set a model for other nations to start their civil rights movement, as seen in Arab Springs and other countries. The civil rights movement gained political success, as mentioned earlier, which led to a social change and more accepted ideology of minority groups. This turning point in history has changed the course of the United States, and that minority groups can go back today and stand beside the white male at a level of greater equality. Without this movement, modern society would not function as it does today socially and politically.
Okay, well, that's all for today. Thanks for tuning in.
Join us in our next week's episode over War on Terrorism.